All right, guys, welcome back. These are the lecture notes for Module 3, and in Module 3, we're going to be covering chapters 4 and 5, the principles of design as well as evaluating art. Um, and as we get started, let's try to imagine the process an artist might go through when he or she begins to create an artwork, right? Every artist has to choose the visual elements that they want to incorporate into their work, but then those elements must be organized in a way that makes sense to the viewer and will convey the artist's intentions. And this is kind of where we see the principles of design come into play. So we'll kind of um, cover and explain how the evaluation of an artwork can change over time and across cultures. We're going to compare formal, contextual, and expressive approaches used in art criticism. We'll describe the relationship between cash value and artistic quality, and then we will demonstrate an understanding of the factual, analytical, and evaluative steps required when writing about an artwork. And then we'll explain censorship as a type of evaluation based on religious, moral, or political values. So let's jump right into it. So, composition, right? This arrangement or organization of visual elements is called the composition. The word design is also a broader term, whereas composition may refer to two-dimensional artworks. Design indicates both the process of organizing as well as the final product, and it can also refer to both 2D and 3D artworks. So design can be a verb, and design is also a noun, right? Joseph Albers once said, "To design is to plan and to organize, to order, to relate, and to control. In short, it embraces all means opposing disorder and accident. Therefore, it signifies a human need and qualifies a man's thinking and doing." So, format, right? In the lecture covering chapter 3, we define the picture plane as a flat two-dimensional picture area within which an artist creates a work of art. The format an artist chooses has a strong influence on the total composition of a particular work. And remember that the format can include a piece of paper, a canvas, a screen, um, a wall, a floor, anything that an artist is using as the base to create work on is known as the format. The artwork, in a sense, is somewhat dictated by its format, and an artist would not draw the same drawing on a sheet of square paper as they would a rectangular piece of paper or a wall, right? Um, so keep those things in mind regarding format. Looking at Charles Demuth's I Saw Figure 5 in Gold. This was meant as a portrait of poet William Carlos Williams, and he was visualizing a poem which he wrote after seeing a fire engine with the number 5 on the side. Um, the moment described in this painting is meant to symbolize both the poet and provide a compelling subject for an artwork. And notice the elements of art used in this work, right? We see a lot of line, a lot of repetition, kind of consider what types of line we're seeing, um, how is color used. So think about those things while you're kind of looking at it, right? And let's go back over those visual elements again to kind of refresh ourselves. Line, shape, mass, space, time, motion, light, color, and texture, right? And I'll back up to this other slide. Let's kind of thinking about those elements, the visual elements of design, right? The 5 is occupying a lot of space. There is a contrast in the size of the numbers. Line is a big deal in this piece, as those diagonal lines are kind of intersecting on a middle point, drawing our eye from the edge of the work into the center, and it's forcing us to kind of follow those 5s down the middle, right? All right, so what we'll be mainly covering for this module is principles of design, right? And this is something new we haven't seen yet. So we've got unity and variety and how those two kind of play together and play off of one another. There's balance, then there's emphasis, subordination, directional forces, repetition, rhythm, and scale and proportion. And I kind of spoke about that a little bit prior, so we'll dive into it a little bit now, right? So let's think about how the artist has used the principles of design to arrange those visual elements in this work, right? Notice the format, right? This format of this painting is a vertically oriented rectangle, or what a lot of people know as portrait format, right? You can see how the artist has taken the format into account and he's arranged them within the format, and they feel like they fit correctly within the picture plane. One of the first things you may notice is the repetition of the number 5, and this repetition creates a visual rhythm that suggests the something moving toward and away from the viewer. The repetition of the numeral 5 also creates unity, right? We can see repetitions of the color red, gold, and different shades of gray. And although this painting uses a consistent color palette and repeats certain colors to create unity, you can also see that he's incorporated a variety of hues, values, and intensities, not just one, right? This isn't a symmetrical work, but it gives us a feeling of being balanced, and the elements feel like they're in the right place. And the three numeral 5s are located near the center of the artwork, and the large 5 is the largest element in the composition. And the artist has used the placement of size and the number 5 to help create emphasis, and he's very clearly emphasized the number 5. While we can see other letters and words which are smaller and positioned away from the center of the composition, those are therefore subordinated. The diagonals in the work suggest a directional force. I kind of mentioned that earlier, how they're guiding your eye from the outer edges towards that center point, right? And finally, the number 5 is present in various sizes, and each numeral shows the same proportion, right? So those number 5s are the same proportion, they're just in various sizes. So moving on to the first principle, unity and variety. So unity is the appearance or condition of oneness, and variety helps to provide density. So a good example of this is John McCracken's Untitled, right? Very few artworks are absolutely unified in every way. This work itself is close to homogeneous. It's painted all the same color, and the artist has intended for this piece to seem quiet and anonymous. So the lack of variety is intentional and serves to communicate the artist's intention. Variety equals essentially the width and height and depth, right? They're all different, but it has the same overall color and texture, and that's where we're seeing the variety, right? Where the variety isn't necessarily something as grandiose as what we'll see in the next slide, but the variety here is that height, width, and depth, where all of those measurements are varying. So kind of on the flip side, this is almost the extreme of variety. Sarah Ceza's triple point, right? It's giving us a lot of diversity and it's countering unity. This is an extreme example of variety, and it looks varied enough to seem chaotic, but the artist is introducing orderly elements, right? Things like these lines that are pulling us in from one side to the other, we'll probably notice that an artwork without variety will seem boring, whereas an artwork with too much variety, such as this one, runs the risk of being confusing or chaotic. And so, let's take a look at work that strikes more of a balance between those two, right? So, like I said, too much unity can be boring. So, Jacob Lawrence's Going Home is a good example of a balance between variety and unity. There's established visual themes. There's repeated and varied elements of those themes. There's a theme of abstraction where figures and luggage are simplified or exaggerated, and the repetition of color and shape of the green chair and seats, right? There's a repetition of the color red for different objects. And the artist was really interested in creating an exciting picture that could hold the attention of its viewers while at the same time feeling unified as a whole, and no element really feels out of place. If you look at the example on the right, you'll see examples of repeated shapes in this work that are kind of helping with that feeling of unity and balance. So digging more into balance, right? balance is the achievement of equilibrium, right? Its acting influences are held in check by opposing forces. In an artwork, there's a desire for visual balance, and this is achieved usually through symmetry or asymmetry. So what are those two and what's the difference, right? Symmetrical balance is the near or exact matching of left and right sides of a form and composition, and asymmetrical is, you probably imagine, the opposite, right? Left and right sides do not match, but various elements are balanced according to their size and meaning and around a felt or implied center of gravity. So looking at the White House, right, this is an example of symmetrical balance, and symmetrical balance is really useful and common in architecture, and it's easier to comprehend than asymmetry and can give a sense of stability, right? Symmetry imposes balanced unity, and it's generally less desirable in sculpture and two-dimensional art because symmetry is predictable, and too much symmetry, again, can be boring or make an artwork feel static. Um, and there's very few artworks that are perfectly symmetrical. But these two or this is a good example of symmetrical balance, right? Damien Hirst's Posterity of the Holy Place. This is an example of perfect symmetry, and it's made up of butterfly wings, and you can see that in the second image that's kind of zoomed in, right? This is made up of two levels of symmetry. Each butterfly has symmetry within itself, and then the overall work is symmetrical. In this work, symmetry serves to organize many, many individual elements, which could be overwhelming otherwise, right? The stability of symmetry can also suggest the divine as well as bringing structure to the composition. So an example of asymmetrical balance, right? Remember that an asymmetrically balanced work still reaches an equilibrium at some point because the artist has balanced the various elements according to their size, meaning, and they're balanced around a felt or implied center of gravity. By Edgar Degas, Jockeys Before the Race, right? This is an extreme case of dynamic balancing. The center of gravity is seen on the right, which is this, like fence post or pole of some kind. The first thing you probably look at is the horse and the rider on the far right, as they're the closest to the viewer and the largest. But then our attention's drawn to the circle in the top left. And the artist leads our attention there in several ways by the feet of the horses, creating an implied diagonal, leading our eye to the left and up. And you can see that in the second example, the dotted line kind of moving from the head of the rider over and across down to the feet, right? And it's kind of this balance that's pulling us from right to left. He's also using color to direct our eye, where the warmest elements like the red cap and the pink jacket are also helping leading our eye to that left. As our attention is directed to the left, we're encountering small vertical line in the background, which is kind of pointing us up to that sun or that circle in the top left corner. The viewer of this painting, which is us, right, is active. We're actually performing the act of balancing this painting as our eye follows the visual cues and travels across it. Mark Di Suervo, Declaration, right? This is an example of a statue requiring structural balance to stand up. And this is a long-standing public art, proven safe in earthquakes and tsunamis, and its engineering was used to balance these long V-shaped wings. All right, so emphasis and subordination, right? These are used to draw attention to an area. Generally, a specific spot or a figure is the focal point. And there's various ways to create emphasis, right? Position, contrast, color intensity, and size. So subordination creates neutral areas of lesser interest that keep us from being distracted from the areas of emphasis, right? Subordinating or pushing those areas back, right? We see subordination at work in Jockeys Before the Race, the painting we just looked at, right? Degas using size, shape, placement, and color to create areas of emphasis away from that center point, where the sun is a focal point created through the contrast, right? Lighter surrounding area, it's the only circle in the painting, and the placement is the only shape in that area of the painting, right? The sky and the grass are muted in color with almost no detail so that they are subordinate to and thus support the areas of interest. All right, directional forces, right? These are implied by a form's axis or connection between similar or adjacent forms or lines. They give us eyes or paths for our eyes to follow provided by an actual or implied line, and they're used to influence the way we look at an artwork. The direction of an actual or implied line is important, right? Different lines communicate different things to the viewer. Vertical implies standing still, horizontal implies at rest, and you've probably heard me mention before, but diagonals suggest motion or dynamism or being dynamic, right? A combination of vertical and horizontal lines, for example, will give a feeling of stability. Think about the floor and walls of a house. If they're at perfect horizontals and verticals, we feel stable. If they're even at slight diagonals, we feel unstable or off balance. And in addition to balance and emphasis or subordination, Degas used directional forces to direct the viewer's eyes in Jacques. But you can take a look back at that if you want, but we're going to look at another artwork where we really start to see directional forces in play, right? So Francisco Goya's bullfight is an example of dramatic use of directional forces. Goya is using directional force to emphasize the drama of this bullfighting scene. So drama is produced by large, isolated, dark focal shapes like the bull and the bullfighter against this really light and muted background. And there's a sense of suspense of spectators in the corner. So looking at it here, right, first he's evoking a sense of motion by placing the bullfighter exactly on the diagonal axis that runs from bottom left to upper right corners, right? You can see that line that goes across. Let's see. I don't know if you're going to be able to see my mouse cursor now. Anyway, so the bull's back legs are reinforcing this feeling, and they're placed along that same line as the bullfighter. The man's hands are located at the position of the dominant horizontal lines in the background, and there's powerful diagonals from the bull's head and front legs that point to the bottom of the pole. So these powerful diagonals I keep talking about from the bull's head and front legs are pointing directly to that bottom of the pole, and he's reinforcing those diagonals with more subtle diagonals in the background, including the direction of the gazes of those spectators. So all of those things are helping to reinforce the diagonal shapes, which are giving even more of a sense of motion, right? So the result is a strong sense of motion from the top left to the right, and everything to the left is needed to balance that out. And the activity in the background is adding visual weight, right, and stability that we need to balance the activity that's happening in the foreground. And so we've seen how he's using directional forces to add drama to the picture, but he's also using them to create a sense of balance, right? The light source is located to the left, causing the bull to cast a long shadow to the right, which is also helping emphasize all of those diagonal lines that are moving towards that right. This is helping to create a really strong horizontal, and the bullfighter is looking down into the right again at the shadow, creating even another implied diagonal. And the implied lines in the foreground are creating a stable triangle, and this triangle serves as the balancing force for the piece. So repetition and rhythm, right? Pattern is a common design strategy in a lot of textile traditions, and it uses a lot of repetition, right? And a regular recurrence of a visual element helps create unity, continuity, flow, and emphasis in a composition. So a good example is this war rug from Afghanistan. For centuries, right, Afghan weavers have made carpets, including imagery from their lives. So if you look closely at the imagery, you can tell this is a contemporary work of art without even looking at the date, because it's including imagery of contemporary warfare, right? It's still traditionally made, but using contemporary content, right? So the repeating imagery and patterns is following that traditional practice, and the repetition is creating unity, but you can see the color of the hand grenades, for example, will vary from one to another. And this color variation, along with a variety of different objects, creates variety as well as unity. And this is a great example of how an artist can create visual rhythm, right? So remember, rhythm refers to any structure of dominant and subordinate elements in a sequence, right? When you hear the word rhythm, you might first think of like music or dance rather than thinking immediately of art. Um, this is created by repeating similar elements, and this is true for music as well as visual art. In this work, we see a visual rhythm, and notice which elements are repeated, like the curved lines, straight lines, solid lines, and dotted lines. And the orientation of these lines, however, is what's varying, what's creating variety. The direction of the lines serve to either lead our eye to the right or to slow down. It helps the way we're looking, and it's providing a sense of stability. And remember the functions of vertical, horizontal, and diagonal lines, and LeWitt has created a rhythm that leads our eye through the composition. So next up is scale and proportion, right? Scale is the relative size of one thing to another, and proportion is the size relationship of parts to a whole, right? So in visual art, we often think of scale as the size of an artwork in relationship to the human body. Is it smaller than I am? Is it bigger than I am? Um, Something larger than ourselves can induce a feeling of wonder, awe, or even fear. And small scale things are more approachable and are more likely to be pleasing and agreeable. Um, this is one important reason that viewing an artwork in person is a totally different experience from looking at art in a book or online. And when we experience art through a photograph of the work, we cannot fully appreciate the scale of the work in the same way as if we were viewing it in person. Many modern and contemporary artists have distorted the scale of what they've created for visual effect. For example, um, Oldenburg wanted to make art more accessible, and so he made sculptures that look like everyday objects. But he's distorted the scale in a humorous way. Um, for this example, he created four huge outlandish shuttlecocks, right? And each were 18 feet high and they weighed over 5,000 pounds. And they were gently mocking the solemnity of the museum that they were surrounding. So, another good example of proportion, right? So, remembering that proportion has to do with the size of each part as a whole in relationship to one another. So, when we look at Michelangelo's Pieta, we may not notice that anything is strange about the proportion because this artist has included so much naturalistic detail and because he's hidden the Mary's body under the drapery. Um, but if you look closely, we'll see that Mary's body is much bigger than Christ's, even though the heads of the two figures are the same size. And if this were an actual person, she would be 8 feet tall. Why is he distorted proportion in this way? Think about trying to make a sculpture of a fully grown man in his mother's lap, and this could be problematic or awkward, right? So distorting the proportion in this way was a design choice. So let's compare the proportion of this one to Michelangelo's Pieta, and this one was carved about 200 years prior. So in this sculpture, the figures are about the same size. This is an unknown artist, but he's made Jesus's body thin and emaciated to deal with the problem of how Mary would support him, right? So this is another design choice: is how would it look visually if Mary was holding a grown man? So to deal with this, he's made his body thin and emaciated to balance out the proportions, right? So this also emphasizes the emotional quality of the work, and the artist is telling a story that is more about the manner of Jesus's death. Um, and both figures' heads are also big in proportion to their bodies, and this work is meant to be expressive rather than overly naturalistic or realistic. All right, Henri Matisse. So design is not inevitable and may result from multiple changes and decisions, right? So one artwork that really helps us understand the decision-making process an artist might go through is this painting. Large Reclining Nude is the title, right? And the artist photographed the progression of his work, taking 24 photographs over 4 months. This is an example of state one, right? So the very first iteration, you might say, of this. And this is probably the most naturalistic and shows traditional rules of like picture plane construction. This is state, what they're calling state, right? Or version or iteration, whatever term helps you understand it the best. So version 9. This version shows an enlarged figure with a weighted right arm and the bold addition of these parallel stripes in the background, right? So looking back at this other one, and then the difference between these two, right? See how much it's changed in 8 iterations, right? Moving on to version 13, right? And I'll just do a quick flash between the two now, and then from version 1, version 9, and version 13. The figure's head is larger, it's more upright. Her head, arms, and shoulders are interacting with the right side of the picture plane in a much different way. There's simplified curves of the torso, and there's a net-like motif of squares on the couch and on the wall. Okay, so this is the final version, right? So let's just take a quick. So 1, 9, 13, and then the final. The left arm is extending to align with the picture frame. The figure's head is smaller. There's new functions to the shapes and lines of the chair and the back and the flowers, or chair back and flowers. There's an intensified pattern on the back wall, and there's an expressiveness of the work, not reliant on facial expression or gestures of the figures. And although the final might look like it was easy to paint, we can see how many decisions that artist made in order to reach this deceptively simple composition, right? So moving on to chapter 5, right? Looking at a work of art like this, right? How do we know if it's good? Many of you may look at this and think it's not good because it's not a photorealistic depiction of a woman. However, we need to acknowledge that the artist's motivations in this case, that not all artwork should be evaluated by whether it is realistic or not. Remember, abstract art, right? So what criteria do we use in this case, and how do we know? Something to think about, our own personal preferences are not adequate for judging whether an artwork is good or not, right? So quality is relative, right? Different people and cultures use different criteria to judge artworks. Like in the, European art tradition, artists' reputations can change over time. Thinking back to Mexico in the Spanish conquest, right? Artists' work were judged based on how much it resembled the style of the Toltecs, which were an ancient people who were admired by the Aztecs. Imagine if we all judge artwork by that standard today, right? All art nowadays would be homogenous or essentially all the same. So many artists that make work that is unpopular when it's made, but you'll see that it gains popularity over time. When Picasso painted his first Cubist work, the contemporaries thought that he had gone just insane. And now that painting, Demoiselle d'Avignon, is greatly admired as being revolutionary to the time, right? Opposites are also true, and many artists who are popular in their day are unknown today because of those changing tastes and standards. So value judgments necessarily involve subjectivity. So looking at Shy Glance, right, this was recovered from a trash bin, lacking skill, but embarrassingly sweet, right? So in contrast, the self-portrait by Vicle Lebrun shows great assuredness of anatomy, right, of human anatomy, and may seem conventional to the contemporary eye. But what we find in a work depends on what we're looking for, right? This is based on personal value judgments. This is based on the viewer, and it involves our own personality. beginning with an open mind before going into snap judgments. And this is how we practice seeing rather than looking, right? Like, what are we seeing when we're looking at a piece, right? So at some point, all of us are engaging in art criticism or making discriminating judgments, both favorable and unfavorable. And there's three basic theories of art criticism: formal theories, contextual theories, and expressive theories. And the professionals who critique art for magazines or newspapers generally follow one of these three basic theories. So a formal theory, right? This is relating to the form of the artwork and the way an artist uses the visual elements and principles for an artwork's formal qualities. Formal theories emphasize the work itself. Contextual theories emphasize the culture, and expressive theories emphasize the artist. So formal theories are generally looking at how a work is made, parts of a composition coming together, organization of the most important factor, values, innovation, and style above all. And remember how chapter 1 defines form versus content, right? A formalist would value form over content, or someone who practices formal theories. And it's a comparison to a work's contemporaries, right? So this work was influenced by Cubism, right? Simultaneous contrasts, right? Then let's take a look at the piece that I referenced prior, right? So this is by Picasso, and this was that piece I was referring to where it was kind of his first step into Cubism, right? We're going to cover this painting in more detail later in the semester, but this is the first Cubist painting by Pablo Picasso, and Cubism itself represents subjects as flattened, abstracted shapes. Remember the definition of abstraction itself, right? It has to do with exaggeration, simplification, or distortion of shapes and subjects, and you can see that very well in Demoiselle d'Avignon, right? The faces and the bodies are distorted, they're exaggerated. You can make out some details, but others you can't, right? And so these are kind of the defining characteristics of Cubism. Going back to this one, right? This was influenced by Cubism, but without overlapping planes, right? The elements fit together more like a jigsaw puzzle than anything. And rather than having overlaps to create spatial relationships, the artist is treating each shape as a curved surface. And notice how each shape is shaded from dark to light or from one hue to another. It's more innovative in color than most early Cubist works, and it explores how one bright or saturated color can have an effect on all of the colors next to it or in relation to it. Um, you know, from a formal analysis, we can say that this painting revises and expands on the artist's inspiration, which is Cubism, in some of its formal characteristics, right? Looking at more formal theories, right? Basquiat, this one's titled Horn Players, and Basquiat was, I'm sure a lot of you have heard of him by now, right? Basquiat was an artist who is known for his formal innovations, and he was doing things in fine art that nobody at the time was doing, right? Techniques he learned from graffiti. These three panels avoid making the work seem like separate paintings, and it makes it feel unified by those repeating elements across the three panels, like the heads, the patches of white, and then all the type or the words, right? It may look improvised, but it's the result of a discipline in his craft, and a formalist would value the innovation in this work. So next, let's start looking at contextual theories, right? So rather than comparing a work to other work being made at the time, critics who use contextual theories look first at the environmental influences on a work of art. Because it's the context that's what's most important. These are called contextual theories. These critics generally ask the question, what else was going on at the time? and they tend to favor works that embody important cultural values or express resistance to those values. So looking back at this piece again, right, this is less interesting from a contextual perspective. And the subject of this like simple landscape, it's not cultural, it's not a political statement. This work doesn't tell us about the early 20th century or the time in which it was made. Um, she does refer in her use of color in the work's title, the law of simultaneous contrast, a theory about the way we perceive color and how it's influenced by neighboring colors, which was a popular optical theory in the time of the work it was made. Um, so this was filled, this work was filled with contextual information, right? It was an homage to the leaders of the bebop movement in jazz, right? Um, Saxophonist Charlie Parker is pictured in the upper left with red music notes coming out of his instrument. Um, and then you can see other clues about the content of the work, right? It's mostly about music, and by reading the words written in the painting, we'll kind of allude to that. Basquiat also affirmed was an important African American part of the musical African American movement, right? All right, so now looking at expressive theories. So these theories are artist centered. Who made it? Who is he or she? And they look for the personal meanings or the deep psychological insight or the human concern. Um, these type of theorists have been strongly influenced by psychoanalysts and gender studies. So looking back at this one again, but more from an expressive theory, right? The cheerful color palette compared to the artist's upbeat personality, right? The painting is expressing something about her as a person. And the color palette recalls bright folk costumes of native Ukraine and is also drawing from her personal story. Looking at Basquiat's through an expressive theory, right? His works are full of personal meaning, right? His use of line is both intent and intense, right? These words could describe the personality of the artist as well. And it's like a three-verse song, right? The three panels feel like a three-verse song where he's referencing the music aspect of this, right? And the work is also exploring the artist's history as an African American by showing examples from the music world and sharing some people in those movements who are important to him as the artist, right? So a big question, right? What makes a masterpiece, right? Some of the key ingredients, some degree of innovation, important contextual meanings, and a recognizable personal statement. In other words, what makes a work of art worthy of being placed in a museum or in an art history book? Not all of these key elements have to be present, but at least one must be present strongly. And something to note, an artist's monetary value is not necessarily an indicator of artistic merit. Um, So some works may sell for a large amount at auction, but that only indicates what a certain group of collectors or an individual collector is willing to pay for them. That does not mean that this is a historically important work of art. And you may not always agree that these works considered by the art world to be masterpieces are worthy of that title, and that's okay, right? It's good to ask ourselves questions about why we think or feel the way we do and be willing to reevaluate our opinions. So, in writing about art, right, all of these facts may not be knowledgeable for every work of art, but we want to describe the work using as many of the facts you can find. If you're looking at a reproduction of the work, it's important to clarify its original medium, size, and texture, right? We want to analyze, we want to ask questions that, these questions can include, how does the choice of medium affect the work? What formal elements did the creator use? Does this fit into a movement or time period, right? Does it lead the way to a new movement or follow behind? Consider also its place amongst the other artists' work, right? If the work was created years ago, how was it received when it was first made? And then we want to evaluate, right? There's three types of those of art criticism: formal, contextual, and expressive, right? Um, Innovative, right? These are the questions to ask. Is it innovative? Does it affect your feelings? Does it express a particular time period or artist personality? Does it communicate social vision or cause? Is it ravishingly beautiful or challenging to the eyes? And what message does the work convey? And how effectively does it accomplish what it's trying to convey? An essay on artwork should include all three steps, right? And you'll notice the steps gradually get harder. Step one is the easiest. Step two requires more study and background knowledge. And step three requires practice and careful seeing, right? As we're learning how to see, right? All right, last up, censorship. Chapter 5 in your textbook deals with making value judgments about various works of art. Censoring an artwork is the ultimate value judgment. Someone who tries to censor a work probably believes that that work has no redeeming value whatsoever. Generally, this is carried out for religious, moral, or political reasons, and the artist's freedom takes a backseat to other important values, right? We see this practice all over history, right? Popes ordered loincloths to be painted over genitals in the Sistine Chapel, right? Um, in Michelangelo's Last Judgment piece, right? Um, dictor, uh, dictor, dictatorial, sorry, that word always messes me up. Dictatorial regimes, right? Like the Nazis, they confiscated modern art in 1937. Um, Islam frowns upon or forbids the depiction of the Prophet Muhammad. In U.S. culture, right, an artwork must be demonstrably obscene and lacking in serious literary, artistic, or political or scientific value in order to be censored, right? Our society places an emphasis on the freedom of the artist where we don't see that a whole lot in other societies or even other time periods, right? So, The Holy Virgin Mary by Chris O'Feely, right? When this work was shown in New York in 1999, New York City, the mayor of New York City tried to close the Brooklyn Museum. Why do you think he was offended by this painting, right? Um, there may be a clue in the media and the materials, right? The painting depicts the Virgin Mary painted in part, right? But the medium was elephant dung, and the Brooklyn Museum operates in a city-owned building, so the mayor went to court to try to evict it and cut off its maintenance funds if the work were not removed from view, right? Um, so O'Feely has a right to interpret the Christian religion in which he was also raised as he chooses, right? And that's the benefit of the country we live in, is that freedom of artistic expression. Um, the court actually sided with the artist in the museum, and the mayor's lawsuit brought record-breaking crowds, right? Um, and this brings a question prompt, right? Explain at least two ways in which an artist can create emphasis in a work of art. For example, an artist may centralize the focal points, and then discuss at least one example, include the title, author, medium, and date. And be sure that as you address this question at the end of your notes, make sure to make specific references to either the lecture or the assigned reading. It's cool. Let's see. So, chapters 4 and 5, principles of art, and then art criticism and how we go about those things. Same as before, we'll have lecture notes. There'll be a quiz, and then differently from the other modules, as I've stated in the announcements, the short essay worksheet, right? That is due at the end of module 3, which will be October 6th. So if you've missed the announcements, if you've somehow missed all the announcements and you didn't see the deadline, it is due October 6th. And if you've already submitted early and you feel like you need to go back and add things in or change a few things, feel free. Just send another submission, and Canvas will tell me which one is the most recent, and I'll grade that one, okay? I won't be grading any of those short answer worksheets until after the 6th to allow you guys to have the time to go in and make revisions or make adjustments to whatever you need. So if you have any questions, as always, email me, and I'll try to address those things as quickly as possible. Um, for module 3, let's all try to do our work sooner, than 11:59 on the due date. If you email me and tell me that you forgot or your Wi-Fi was down at midnight, well, you had 2 weeks to do it, right? So, you know, plan accordingly, right? Um, this will be ready to rock probably, what's today? The 21st. So this should be up and running on the 22nd. So thank y'all, and let me know if any questions.